we have heard until now is that with runoff mitigation measures, it's really crucial to know where to implement the measures and what kind of runoff needs to be mitigated. So the essential first step is to really have a runoff risk diagnosis. This means we need to identify the basic runoff risk given by the pedoclimatic conditions, but we also need to look for the agricultural practices, cropping practices, as well as soil management practices, and also look out for the concentrated flow issues in the catchment, which connect different fields even. And when we have identified the situation for the runoff risk, then we can go to our toolbox and select from a broad variety of runoff measures which might be suitable here, and give hopefully the farmers even the flexibility to choose the right one and the most easiest one to implement. And these runoff risk mitigation measures might then, of course, involve changing the soil management practices, influencing also the cropping practices that the farmer has on his fields or on the whole slope. We, of course, can advise off-site buffers and retention structures for him to mitigate concentrated flow issues, and also, last but not least, optimize the crop protection practices, which is quite essential as well. Basic to all of the runoff mitigation measures literally is that we need to increase the infiltration of water, preferably at source, that means in the field, and if this is not possible, then collect the runoff somewhere and there have a slow infiltration process in place. This is just to show you the general setup of the best management practices, of the mitigation measure description. You have, first of all, a statement of what to do, a very concise statement, clear communication, which will form the core of the harmonized EU mitigation measure. We don't expect too much change there because they are effective in principle everywhere, but when we come to the specifications, the how to do it, of course, there we need then the details, which are subject to country-specific changes because of legislative issues or special pedoclimatic situations. Just an example how this could look like, a statement like manage tramlines to avoid concentrated runoff, and then you have in the specifications what to do, how to do it. So, for example, position the tramlines whenever possible across the slope, not downslope. If possible, shift the tram lines to avoid compaction in these areas. Also use all kinds of means to avoid compaction by driving over these tram lines too often, like low pressure tires. And of course, if you already have concentrated flow issues and you can't shift the tram lines, then at least disc them after passing the tractor, making a rough surface, vegetate them if possible, that's not always possible of course, or equip them with bunds. We clustered the measures into different categories. These are the main working areas for the farmer. So clearly one of the most important measures is a good soil management in the field, stopping runoff at source if possible, and one of the best known ones, but that still need to be better implemented, especially in Europe, is reduced tillage intensity. Here the main effects are of course improving aggregation and the pore continuity, so the infiltration capacity of the soil and the rate, and also by having higher organic matter in the topsoil as well as mulch residues on the soil surface to reduce microerosion and slaking. Managed tramlines we have already seen on the slide before. Other ones are, for example, prepare a rough seed bed, also to increase surface roughness and reduce the speed of runoff. Establish in-field bunds is quite a clever measure if you have row crops in a field like potatoes. There you can see on this slide here that you have small bunds between the rows of the potatoes. If you have a green symbol, it shows is a best management practice example. If you have a red symbol at the picture, it shows you that this is a worst management practice or a bad management practice example. Other ones in the soil management cluster is do contour tilling and disking whenever possible, of course. Also, quite important, manage surface soil compaction, not only directly on the tram line, but on the whole field. Especially the capping and the crusting of soils need to be minimized or even broken if existing by managing residues on the soil surface and organic matter. And subsoil compaction is quite important as well. Plow pans, for example, that have developed So avoid working too moist soils is quite important. And if we already have a subsoil compaction that is critical for the water flow, then we need to break it up. Moving to the next cluster or category for our runoff mitigation measures, it's about cropping practices. Here, of course, one of the main aims is to have a good crop rotation in place, where we also have a very good aggregate structure developing in the crops or on the field by having deep rooting crops once in a while, or also managing the organic matter by this way, and always have a good dense vegetation cover. Strip cropping, that's quite important if you have very long slopes and where you then can position in strips your crops across the slope. So you could alternate between summer and winter crops to manage vegetation cover, as well as broadcast crops, and row crops could be alternated. So that would mean that you're using the crop itself as a buffer when water comes downslope, for example, from a row crop. Annual cover crops, anyway, this is a very good measure to also increase soil fertility and organic matter, but it's also important to really have a dense vegetation cover whenever possible on the field to minimize the rain splash erosion and then the runoff that occurs afterwards. And last but not least, we have seen a nice example from the problems that we have in the Italian catchment. Perennial cover crops are quite important in orchards and vineyards. They are picked up quite often already, but when we have water-stressed areas, they compete sometimes for water, and then we need to have smart measures to really minimize the water competition in the critical times of the year. Next category is vegetative buffers. The first 4 ones are really about where to position the buffers. Starting with the riparian buffers, there we are downslope, it's the line of last defense. Often it's not even enough to have a small buffer right beside the stream, because if you have concentrated runoff already arriving at the top of the buffer, then it usually breaks through. So we need to disperse it close to the source. So that means edge of field buffers are established upslope, where really we have runoff prone fields. And we have seen a good example where Talweg buffers are needed, so where 2 slopes come together and the runoff concentrates on a field, there we can also try to maximize the infiltration of runoff water. And last but not least, which is of course a quite drastic measure, is if the field is a very long slope, is quite a steep slope, it makes sense to break it, to have a vegetative buffer within the field to break up the slope. But of course, this would mean that the farmer has a smaller area to manage and also would have more maneuvering problems with his machinery. Quite a special one, type of vegetative buffer zone is a managed field access area, especially when it's downslope. This is a very critical position, because then the runoff water will directly go to a road or enter a ditch beside the road, and then this water can really run for kilometers in the catchment and reach the next surface water. The next one are special forms of vegetated buffers. Of course, hedges are quite important also if you need windbreaks, additional spray drift mitigation, and they also have additional biodiversity benefits. So when it comes to funding possibilities, hedges might be a quite interesting measure as well. Of course, woodlands, nobody is just establishing woodlands because he has a runoff issue that's quite also drastic. But if woodlands are to be established anyway due to other reasons, you can position them smartly, or if you have woodlands in your catchment, then you use them also as a buffer device for runoff that might occur. Next category, it's about retention structures. So if concentrated runoff is probable, or you cannot even avoid it by infield measures, then the only choice that we have is to collect the concentrated runoff and make it slowly infiltrate. So if you do this close at the source and you have a small extent of runoff water, you could, for example, like here, have a bonding at the edge of the field and infiltrate the runoff. Then of course this will impact a little bit this part of the crop, that's clear. The other 2 ones are really off-site then. If you have a just linear space, for example, beside a road, you could, for example, establish a vegetated ditch which is usually dry, but when the runoff water comes in, it collects here, it not directly runs over the road or forms concentrated runoff. Of course, this ditch then is closed and it should not be connected, of course, to a surface water channel. That's important. So it's an infiltration trowel, really. And last but not least, the retention ponds that are already there for storm flow mitigation might be used also to sedimentate particles coming from fields, together with fertilizers, crop protection products, everything that's carried with the storm flow. And if we establish a new one, of course, then we can have an artificial wetland. And here we have additional benefits like biodiversity benefits, again to consider. But on the other hand, we need to make sure that if we have an endangered species in these newly constructed areas, that this will not impact on the use and the aim of this mitigation measure. So this needs to be taken care of. So clearly one of the quite important categories is to adapt the use of pesticides when it comes to mitigation of crop protection product runoff from agricultural areas. So one is, of course, to adapt the short-term application timing. Be sure that you don't apply shortly before significant or heavy rainfall. That's important. But it's also a question of to optimize the seasonal timing. So if you know when your drain flow season typically starts and when it stops, and you apply products or even fertilizers at that time, then of course you have a very high chance, because the water is saturated at that time, that it quickly goes down to the drains, for example, or saturated runoff is forming there, and then we have quite high concentrations in runoff water. So that's quite important. And to adapt the product and rate selection, of course, that's a probable measure as well. First of all, of course, we need to look for the crop protection requirements that we have. But if the water contamination is known there and it does not improve because due to, for example, fighting point pollution sources, then we need to think about other mitigation measures as well. Optimize the product choice with regard to seasonal timing, as seen here before, the use rate or the substance properties. And also, if possible, minimize treated area. Use smart technologies like sensor-based technologies or bonded sprayers. And in the end, this shall result in a reduction of the pollution of water. So this is an overview slide, and you will discover that there's another category here at the bottom. It's the optimized irrigation category. So this is a very specialized one, so I didn't put it on an extra slide here. This is something that we learned really from our Spanish project partners, that in irrigated fields, irrigation may cause runoff as well if it's not done in a correct way. So we have two basic measures here defined: adapt the irrigation technique, go from high usage of water like flood irrigation to sprinkler, or from sprinkler to drip irrigation. So this is also good for water management in its quantitative aspects. And of course, optimize the irrigation timing and rate. Use smart irrigation, have soil moisture sensors in the soil, and only irrigate if the water capacity is really high, if the soil is not saturated, so that you don't lose your runoff, your irrigation water with runoff. So that shall have been the short overview. In the end, we will have defined quite a number of measures for different sites in the catchment. This is then integrated really into a risk management plan, like you see here the example, the quite famous example of Fontaine-du-Teil in France from Avalis, where they did it the first time and showed it quite nicely. And here an example from another catchment where you see a nice mosaic of different windbreaks, filter strips, riparian forests, and so on. And this is, of course, something that we would like to see also to increase the heterogeneity of the landscape and make it more interesting. But we are aware, of course, that the most difficult part is making implementation of measures happen. And here we need to be smart about funding mechanism and incentives, of course, for farmers. So that's it from my side, and thanks for your attention.